Blood stained the dust. Enough. Behind him, a rider quietly put his hand to his gun. The dry whoosh echoed through the stable, mingling with the smell of sour sweat and damp straw. Fresh blood streaked darkly across her brown linen skirt. He always forgave the second blow, slipping it past his shoulder to show his twisted mercy. At that moment, the stable door opened. He swallowed hard but did not retreat. His voice trembled like a taut string. Enough, Silas frowned. The whip stopped in midair. This farm is forbidden to strangers, Ada gasped. Run, little girl. Your father did you teach him so stupidly that he would be buried early? Silas spat. Then he looked up, his eyes hard beyond their years. A heavy boot crunched behind him. Silas spun. Jesse, wait outside. His voice was low and steady. The boy hesitated, then stepped back, the sunlight swallowing the small figure. Silas lifted his chin. Are you lost? Seeing the door open, hearing the shout, thinking there was a fire. The man answered, his eyes sliding past Ada, stopping on the blood. It was just a vicious fire. Ada tried to push herself up, but her mind was spinning. She is my wife. None of your business, Silas growled. So you treat your wife like a plow mule? The other asked, his voice heavy as gravel. Silas raised his whip and struck. He was fast, but the stranger's hand was faster. There was a soft snap, and Silas's wrist was grabbed and squeezed. Let go, Silas growled, trying to pull away. My name is Wyatt Thornhart. The other man was calm, the force on his fingers increasing, and he had just lost the right to touch her. He staggered back, staggering. You don't know me. The law's on my side. The law of the strong, I don't care. Ada held her back, her breathing ragged. Wyatt turned to look at her. Do you have anywhere to go? She mouthed dryly. No, if you want it. Silas laughed. She is sterile, useless. Take her home and raise her as a debt. Maybe she is not useless, but has never been cherished. Ada trembled at the words. Something strangely warm ran down her bloody spine. I will go. The words came before the thought. Silas widened his eyes, blushed, and shouted, Ada, you have nothing. You starve out there. She could have the name Thornhart if she wanted it. The name Kincaid would have no meaning then. He led Ada to the barn door. Ada hesitated at the steps. Wyatt asked softly, Are you sure? Then her eyes caught sight of Silas in the darkness of the stable lips. Pursed eyes, blazing hands, clasping swollen wrists. I don't know who I'll become, but I know I can't stay. Enough. Wyatt smiled softly, guiding her onto the bench. That was enough. He jerked the reins and Jesse jumped into the wagon. The wooden wheels crunched dry dirt, swirling dust. Ahead was the red road that led to sunburned grassy hills. When the carriage stopped, the 4 Thornhart children jumped out. Jesse stayed, offering Ada a hand, but she hesitated. Wyatt circled down his arm, steady. Come on in. This was your place now, if you wanted it. Ada put her hand on his elbow. She couldn't remember the last time she'd smelled that warm, yeasty scent. Jesse led Ada to a chair in the corner, whispering, Sit here. Bab, I like to sit at the end of the table. You sit close to the stove to keep warm. Ada smiled slightly. She had never been called sister by a child. It felt strange but pleasant. Wyatt took his hat off the shelf, washed his hands in the wooden sink by the door. His voice was loud enough to be heard. It's been a long day. Let's eat. Ray ladled the soup. Maggie put the bread on the plate. Ray just nodded, neither saying yes nor grumbling. Everything went smoothly, as if each person knew their place in a familiar play. Ada wanted to stand up to help, but Ray glanced at her. Sit down. Your hands are shaking. If you drop it, it'll be a waste of bread. The words were abrupt, but the tone was not unpleasant, just the straightforward manner of a child who had grown up a little too early. Ada was quiet. The bread was golden, the crust cracked, and the scent of ripe grain. The stew had beef potatoes, carrots, onions. The smoke was warm and peppery. Wyatt clasped his hands briefly. Thank God for the meal. Thank the hands that made it, and thank you for the new friend at our table. The table was silent for a few seconds. Then Ray passed the soup. Bertie carried the basket of cakes, her hands shaking as if holding a treasure. That cake Ray baked. It's delicious. Ada took a small piece, chewing slowly. The crispy crust cracked softly, The inside was soft. The yeast was still warm. It was too hot, her tongue was numb, but she didn't stop. The warmth seeped through her chest, soothing the ache in her shoulder. The meal passed without argument, without scolding. The child who was elbowing her still got a glare from Ray, but the glare was over. Ada was embarrassed when she was past the first ladle of meat. At Silas's house, she ate later, gnawing on the bones covered in cold oil. Here, no one fought for the best part, but everyone paid attention to each other. Jesse told the story of catching a garter snake in the field. Bertie listened with wide eyes. Maggie grumbled because Jesse made it up to make it more exciting. Wyatt just smiled. At the table, Ada spoke little, but her gaze gradually stopped hiding. The wariness receded inch by inch, like a mud wall cracking after a long rain. After the meal, Ray washed the dishes. Maggie wiped the table. Jesse led the horse, and Wyatt took Ada down the ground floor hallway. The wooden floor creaked under his shoes, the scent of pine wafted in the air. He stopped at the last door, handing her a small brass key. This room used to belong to the children's mother. It was locked from the inside. The youngest baby Bertie sometimes dreamed of knocking on the door at night, looking for someone to hold her. If she wasn't willing, just lock it. Ada touched the latch, gently pushing. The room was bright thanks to the half-open, cream-colored linen curtains, the low wooden bed placed against the wall, the quilt patched with many old but clean pieces of cloth. On the dresser, a vase of wildflowers held a few wilted daisies, probably placed long ago, but still exuded a gentleness. "I don't know how to repay you." Wyatt folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Someone once gave me another chance to live. Now I just transfer the debt. Here you don't owe anyone anything." After saying that, he placed the key on the dresser, nodded slightly, then stepped back and closed the door. Ada stood in the middle of the strange room, suddenly feeling her chest expand, as if every wall in her heart had just moved a breath. She sat down on the bed. The mattress was soft, not too soft, but far from the damp ground behind Silas's sheep pen. Whenever she closed her eyes, she could hear the whip across her skin. Now the echo was still faint, but not enough to drown out the sound of spoons hitting the stove, the distant laughter of children. Ada took off her shirt, cleaned the wound with the warm water Ray had brought. The edge of the whip was left with a purple-red zigzag mark. She gritted her teeth and applied mutton fat and bandages herself. White. In the dim mirror hanging on the wall, her back was bruised, but her brown eyes were no longer dull. They sparkled with curiosity about the house, the children, and the man outside who had never asked her, "What good is it?" early morning. The rooster crowed, the sound of a hammer pounding on a stake in the yard. Ada jumped up, a sharp pain reminding her to be careful. She put on clean clothes and stepped out onto the porch. Ray was lighting the fire. Maggie ran to get goat's milk. Bertie hugged a ragged straw doll, chattering away. Ray looked up, frowning slightly. "You can sleep a little longer. The wound is not healed yet." Ada tugged at her sleeve. "Just stand by. Teach me how to mix the dough." Ray raised her eyebrows, then nodded. Ada rolled up her sleeves and rubbed the dough, her movements clumsy but patient. Her hands were covered in white flour, and Ray let out a rare laugh. Maggie ran in, surprised to see the new person in the kitchen, happily handing over a bottle of milk. When the second loaf came out of the oven, Ada heard the sound of horse hooves. She looked out the window. Wyatt and Jesse rode back, red dust on their shoulders. Jesse waved, Bertie jumped. Ada stood still, feeling as if she were waiting for a shout. But the door opened. Wyatt only took off his gloves, smiling at Ray. "The smell of the new bread was enough to bring the three of you home early." His eyes glanced at Ada, paused for a moment, and nodded in greeting. The look made her feel awkward, not because of fear, but because of strange warmth. That afternoon, Jesse invited Ada to go to the field to watch the field mouse traps. The boy gestured to show how to set the bait, his eyes shining. Ada listened, finding herself smiling genuinely without forcing it. The summer sun spread golden across the grass. The wind blew gently, the smell of dry soil rose, mixed with the scent of wild wormwood. "Will you stay here forever?" Jesse suddenly asked, his voice clear. She paused. He looked at her, his brown eyes intelligent. "This house likes you." Ada tightened the edge of her scarf hesitantly. "I will try to stay if I can." Jesse nodded like an adult. "Dad said home is where you don't have to worry about the key being in someone else's hands. I have the room key, so it's my house. The wind blew his hair, revealing a small scar on his temple. Ada touched it lightly. Why is there this scar fall from a horse last season? Dad bandaged it. It doesn't hurt anymore. She lowered her hand, her heart filled with sorrow, because she feared she hadn't been able to protect this child from the other whips of life. But then she remembered Wyatt's eyes, Ray's toughness, Maggie's chirping, Birdie holding her doll, and the warm smell of the yeast. It turned out that not all wounds had to be as hard as stone. They could be soft and still not break. The sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows. Ada turned back, holding the basket of field mice Jessie had caught. She still limped because of her sore back, but her steps were no longer timid. The wooden gate of the farm stood tall, unlocked. Inside, Ray lit the stove, the fire flickering, casting a red glow on the pine walls. Ada stepped through the doorway. In a tiny moment, she realized that her heart wasn't pounding wildly because she was afraid of being stoned or scolded. It was just beating, normally, and normal to her was suddenly a priceless gift. That night, for the first time in 5 years, Ada slept through the morning without dreaming of whiplash, without sitting up in shock. Behind the locked door, she heard the rooster crowing, Ray lifting the curtains, the smell of bread on the coals, and smiled. The Highland summer came in full swing, the sun cutting across the hillsides like a sharp knife, draining the moisture from the soil. 3 weeks since Ada stepped through the gates of Thornhart Farm, she had become familiar with the rhythm of life here. Waking Birdie early in the morning, turning on the coal stove for Ray, measuring milk with Maggie, weeding the garden at noon, helping Wyatt mend sheep nets or sew saddles in the afternoon. Her back was still sore, but the whip marks were purple and yellow. Her flesh slowly healed like cracked earth, meeting the first rain of summer. Wyatt was quiet, but whenever he was busy plowing the last acre of the field, he left the whole house to Ada without hesitation. That silent trust stunned her more than any compliment. Ray, Maggie, and Birdie also stopped prying. Ray let Ada count the flour, Maggie showed off the new goat, and Birdie hugged Ada's neck and told her story about the doll. Ada, let me weave you a mulberry leaf skirt. Jesse, the boy who had shouted enough, became the closest bridge. He only needed a glance to understand whether Ada wanted to be quiet or laugh. One afternoon, the sky was cloudless. The air was hot, the dry straw smelled of burning. Wyatt and Jesse piled the big bundle of hay up into the barn. Ada washed the vegetables in the well, occasionally glancing back at the big barn. The sound of the pulley rope creaking and the rustling of falling grass echoed from the barn. She was about to bring the water to the father and son when the dry wood cracked, then a heavy hooch echoed in the barn. Ada threw down the basket of vegetables and ran. Inside, the grass was thick. Jesse lay motionless at the foot of the ladder, his face pale, sweating. His right leg was twisted at an indescribable angle, his pants leg bulging, blood soaking the fabric. Wyatt knelt beside him, his voice low but trembling. Take a deep breath, son. Ada's old instincts kicked in quicker than the memory of the whip. She knelt down and touched Jesse's ankle. The tibia was clearly displaced. He held his breath but did not cry. Ada looked up at Wyatt. You have to set it. The sooner, the less swelling. Wyatt nodded, rubbing the pain in his eyes, then went into action. He unbuckled his belt, took off his jacket, and spread it across Jesse's back. Ada tore at her skirt, finding 2 straight pieces of wood. She did each move without a pause, as if the beatings of the past had taught her by heart how to save herself. Jesse, look at me. She held his chin, her voice soft but firm. It's going to hurt, but I'm here. He took a breath, nodded. Ada pressed gently, rotating the joint. The bone clicked. Jesse screamed, his veins bulging. Wyatt held his shoulder, tears threatening to fall, but not falling. When the bone was in place, she clamped the splint and bandaged it tightly. Her eyes stung from the smoke of the weed and the memories the time Silas had straightened her arm and laughed at her sleeves to train her to endure. Jesse passed out, his breathing shallow. Ada told Wyatt, get a stretcher, carry her home. I'll boil comfrey leaves with white wine, apply a compress to reduce the swelling. He obeyed without hesitation, like a soldier obeying a trusted general. The kitchen had been transformed into a sick room all afternoon. Ray lit the fire. Maggie washed the towels. Birdie sat on the edge of the bed, singing lullabies to keep Jesse from writhing when he woke. Ada rebandaged him, applied the medicine, changed the bloody gauze. By late evening, Jesse's fever had subsided, and he slept soundly, each heave of breath pouring a handful of anxiety onto Ada's chest and then slipping away into relief. Wyatt waited until the children were asleep before pushing open the kitchen door, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. Ada was soaking towels in a basin of cold water, her fingers glowing red. He stood there, the oil lamp casting a muscular shadow against the wall, and said hoarsely, "Thank you." Ada shook her head, her hair falling over her forehead. "I just did what I had to do." But she saw his hand tremble. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his dark brown eyes filled with remorse. "If I had been more careful, he wouldn't have fallen." Ada dipped a new towel, wrung it out. "An accident is still an accident. Fear only shows that I still love you." The words that came out surprised her. Wyatt looked at her for a long time as if considering something, then spoke slowly. "The day Silas swung the whip, I saw the way you gritted your teeth as if you were used to pain. Don't get used to it anymore. Here pain has a reason." Ada pursed her lips, her heart aching. She remembered the room in the early morning, remembered the fragrant cake, remembered Bertie putting her hand in the doll. Those little things began to pile up into new bricks, although the old mortar in her heart was still cracked. That night she didn't lock the door. The door was ajar. The river breeze blew gently, bringing the scent of wild pollen, and Ada took a nap next to Jesse's bed to watch each breath. 3 days later, Jesse was able to smile at Bertie, joking that limping is cooler than walking straight. On the contrary, Ray became even quieter. Ada caught her standing by the sheep pen, her hands squeezing the handle of the hoe until they were white. She approached, motioning to ask. Ray snorted. "Dad has never let a boy climb so high in years. The older girl has to watch. I should climb." Ada understood that Ray was afraid. She put her hand on her shoulder, not arguing. Ray trembled for a moment and then burst into tears, hot tears running down her tan cheeks. Ada hugged Ray, feeling like she was the one holding her for the first time, not the one doing the lifting. Late in the afternoon, while Ada and Maggie were raking the yard, a strange cloud of dust rolled down the main road. A tall horse galloped to the gate, kicking up a layer of red dust. On the saddle was Silas Kincaid. He was thinner, his beard was gray, his eyes were red from alcohol or some sour anger. Ada put down the broom, her veins frozen. Every step of revival suddenly shrank like a young shoot in frost. Silas did not bother to get off his horse, his voice hoarse. "Ada, come out." Wyatt walked out of the barn, hammer in hand. Maggie slipped into the house and pulled Bertie Ray through the hoe by the kitchen door, standing silently like a small shield. Jesse, crutches under his arm, crept out onto the porch, but Ada shook her head. Silas pointed the whip at Wyatt. "Do you know she's mine by the marriage of the church?" Wyatt said calmly. "I know she's not property. She chooses." Silas laughed, a shrill laugh mixed with a dry cough. "Choose, you barren woman, can only choose to shut up. I built a cradle 3 winters ago and it's still empty." He emphasized the last sentence like a slap. Ada felt her side ache again, not from the whip, but from the memory of the wooden cradle etched in her eyes throughout the long dark night. But Wyatt said, his voice low and not high enough to shatter that laugh. "The cradle is empty because my heart is empty. It's useless to blame anyone else." He dropped the hammer, took 2 more steps, his posture both leisurely and motionless, like a stone pillar. Silas blinked, reined in his horse, and was about to charge straight. Wyatt did not raise his fist nor draw his gun. He stopped within reach of his horse, his eyes unwavering. "If you step through this gate again, I will consider you an invader. I will protect my family." "Since when do you have the right to call her family?" "The day she said she would stay. The day she saved my son. The day she made the cakes the children called Sister Ada's cakes." The wind changed direction, carrying the smell of Silas's sweat and the sweet smell of hay from the yard. Ada suddenly felt like there were 2 worlds, a noisy, cracked world of whips and a quiet, wide world, where the clatter of the stove was enough to cover the sound of her heartbeat. She looked straight at Silas, her voice unwavering. "I will not return, even if I am empty-handed, even if I have to walk across the desert. You have no right to me." Silas smirked, but the hand holding the whip suddenly trembled. He found no reason to strike, no darkness, no walls, no fear on her face. Wyatt took a half step forward, saying nothing, just standing, his back straight as a fence. Finally, Silas snorted, turned the horse, and stomped his heels. Red dust rose, The wind carried the smell of stale liquor. Ada held her breath until the horse disappeared around the bend. Wyatt turned. The late afternoon sun touched his cheeks with orange, and sweat rolled down his temples. He asked softly, "Are you okay?" Ada meant to say yes, but her voice was choked. Instead, she nodded. Jesse limped over on crutches a few feet tall, but standing partially in front of Ada, as his father had done. Night fell earlier than usual, as if the sun were tired. Ada wiped the kitchen table, her hands shaking slightly. Ray handed her a glass of water, saying nothing. Wyatt then knocked lightly on the kitchen door, hesitating. She turned. He touched the brim of his hat, his deep brown eyes sparkling with blue fire. "Ada, if someday you feel like a new family, the town church is always open. I don't force you. I just want you to know it exists." With that, he stepped back, leaving her in the silence. Ada put her hand to her chest where her heart was beating, both aching and warm. For a moment, her back ached again. But the pain was not fear. It was new skin growing under the scar, tingling, signaling a new life about to close. She turned off the light, stood watching the moonlight slide across the gravel yard. In the pale light, the limp child, the thin-shouldered girl, the wooden man all cast long, seamless shadows. Ada understood whether Silas returned or not. She was no longer alone in this land. 2 days had passed since Silas's appearance. Like a sunset, the atmosphere at Thornhart Farm was as tense as a bowstring. Ada still helped Ray bake, still helped Bertie climb the swing, but every distant hoofbeat made her heart jump. Night fell. Wyatt placed a Winchester behind the kitchen door. Jesse, his leg in a splint, sat on the porch carving and recarving each brass bullet. Ray no longer complained about staying up late to replace her father on patrol. She tied her hair up, hiding her fear in the stiff rope tied tightly. On Tuesday morning, the sun was still high. Wyatt knocked lightly on Ada's door. She opened it, still wearing a simple brown cloth shirt, but with dark circles under her eyes. Wyatt entered, the smell of early morning sun lingering on his shirt. He held a thin piece of paper with the town hall seal. "I want a marriage license." The words came out not as a command nor quite as a request. It was as if he had laid a new plank in the crack in the wall, slowly and firmly. Ada squeezed the edge of her scarf, her throat dry. "Silas will use the law," Wyatt continued, "so we will use the law itself to stop him. But only if you really want to." Ada remembered Wyatt's hand gripping Silas's wrist, remembered Ray's eyes as she stood in his way. With the pickaxe, remembered Jesse on his wooden crutch, wincing and pulling the trigger with one hand. In all that bravery, she saw a future. Not a peaceful future, but one where she could breathe and stand. "We're going," she answered, hoarse but determined. The town of Red Willow was nestled in the pines, the midday dust swirling down the main road. The little white wooden church had a steeple broken in half by last year's storm. The old minister, bald, his black coat faded, gave Wyatt a knowing look. He had been warned. Inside, there were only 2 rows of pews, the picture of Christ giving loaves and fishes, hanging crookedly. Ada stepped through the doorway, her modest skirt touching the old wooden platform. She wasn't wearing white. She had chosen a Ray indigo dress that had heeled at the seams, a round collar and short sleeves that hid the faded marks of her whip. Bertie had pinned a sprig of dried lavender in her hair, a sweet scent. Wyatt stood beside her, his dark brown coat, his hat pulled back and held to his chest. The minister asked short questions, his voice shaking with age. Wyatt Thornhart, willingly. Ada Kincaid, willingly. Each answer came clearly, without a tremor. When the minister told them to hold hands, Wyatt reached out first, waiting. Ada placed her hand on it. The calluses were rough against the old scars. 2 broken lives were scraped together like pieces of pottery heated over a fire. The iron pens scratched the paper, making a rustling sound. Ada watched as the new name gradually appeared, Ada Thornhart. The black ink spread slightly, spreading into a withered but fragrant flower. She inhaled deeply, as if swallowing the metallic taste of the ink into her chest. Just then, the sound of hooves was heard in the churchyard. The wooden door swung open and hot air rushed in, along with the silhouettes of Silas Kincaid and 2 tall men with pistols dangling from their waists. Silas was red with wine, and the smell of alcohol was strong. "Stop!" he shouted, his eyes as red as the bottom of a whiskey bottle. "That paper is worthless. She is my wife." Wyatt did not let go of Ada's hand but turned his shoulder to cover her half. Silas rushed forward, holding up the old crumpled marriage certificate. This priest personally performed the ceremony for us at Rock Creek. Sealed. The old priest shook his hand, looking at Ada, and then at Wyatt. Ada stepped out from behind Wyatt, her voice strangely calm. The day you beat me until I bled, your vows were rotten. Today I choose. Silas stared, signaling the man in gray to draw his gun. The metallic click rang coldly in the sacred air. But from the side door, another metallic sound was sharper. Ray had set her double-barreled gun up almost to shoulder level. She didn't speak, but the silent gray look made the gray man pause. On the bench, Jesse was limping through the door on crutches, the shotgun with the butt cut off held to his chest, the barrel aimed low but ready. Maggie stood behind him, Birdie in her arms, her eyes flashing. Wyatt walked down the 2 steps, picked up the paper Silas had waved, and spread it out. "This is a contract of whips and fear," he said, his voice booming. "And this," he held up the newly signed paper, "is a contract of freedom. The law recognizes this signature. The judge sealed it this morning." "If you move an inch, you are a trespasser," Silas growled, glancing at the 4 barrels of guns, from child to man, aimed at him. He flinched, but he was not defeated. "Keep her," he hissed. "She's still a spare infertile." Ada took a step forward, her palms wet with sweat. Stinking but hard voice. "The cradle is empty because your house is empty. This house is full of children, full of cakes, full of laughter." "How can that be too much?" Silas choked, his fingers twitching around the handle of the whip. The gray man and the brown man near him glanced at each other, realizing that the scales were no longer tilted. Finally, Silas spat, turned sharply, jerked the reins, and the horse kicked up dust and left. The 2 men followed silently, carrying with them the stench of alcohol that faded in the midday sun. The minister closed the door, his old hands shaking. He asked softly, "Shall we continue the ceremony?" Wyatt looked at Ada. She nodded. The brief blessing rang out again, flowing like a stream through the cracked wood. This time, no one rushed in. No one cracked the whip. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Wyatt merely placed his lips on Ada's forehead, a touch lighter than a hair. Afternoon, the carriage returned to camp. Ray rode ahead on horseback. Jesse sat in the back. Maggie smiled and said, Mother Ada," which Birdie chirped along with. Ada blushed, not used to the word mother, but did not object. Wyatt sat next to her on the bench, the wind blowing the baby hairs around his temples, carrying the scent of sweat grass and the warmth of a newlywed. Life did not change instantly because of a piece of paper. That night, Ada was still in the same room, the door still locked from the inside. Wyatt did not enter. He placed a glass of warm milk and half a slice of cornbread on the doorstep and left. Ada held the glass of milk, feeling the heat rise to her wrist, suddenly remembering the nights when Silas made her kneel on the cold ground and eat dry crumbs. The distance between past and present was only the temperature of a sip of milk. A few hours later, the clanking of horse hooves broke the silence. But this time it was not Silas. Mayor Clay Morton rode up carrying a warrant from the county court. Silas Kincaid was under formal investigation for domestic violence, with an additional charge of assault with a weapon. Ada signed the warrant with a shaking hand, but Wyatt held the paper steady so the ink wouldn't smudge. The family knew the warrant wouldn't stop Silas, but at least the law wasn't behind him. The last person to leave that night was Ray. She finished clearing the dishes and stood in the kitchen, hesitating. Ada took off her apron and asked softly, "What do you want to say?" Ray looked down at her worn boots. "I've never called anyone Mom, except the dead." Ada's heart ached, but she only opened her hand. Ray leaned in slowly, not crying, just letting out a long sigh, her breath smelling of flour and wood smoke. Ada stroked her hair gently. Outside, the night wind blew through the thatch like a hesitant lullaby. At the door, Wyatt watched the moment, his hand loosely holding his hat. He turned away silently, leaving mother and child standing in the dim glow of the oil lamp, and began to weave a thread, both more fragile and more durable than any oath. Near midnight, Ada returned to her room unlatched. She placed the half-warm glass of milk on the table and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, Ada Thornhart. The new name fell from her lips like raindrops rolling down a tin roof, tapping out the coming of another season. If Silas returned, she would no longer be simply the runaway wife. She was the chosen one and the chosen one. The cool breeze caressed the healed whiplash. Outside the yard was quiet save for the breathing of the sheep and the lonely cricket under the floorboards. Ada closed her eyes, feeling her heart calm down, not because of absolute safety, just because for the first time she believed she had a place to hold on to when the storm came. The harvest had not yet begun, but the barley in the yard had turned yellow and gray, as if the sky and earth were holding their breath, waiting for change. After the wedding, Ada tried to force herself into a routine, rising at dawn, heating cornflakes, teaching Bertie to spell, sitting next to Ray as she pieced together her dead mother's unfinished quilt. But every evening the August wind would stir up red dust from the road, blow the smell of dry earth, and an uneasy feeling would creep into the kitchen. One hot afternoon, Sheriff Boyd rocked his sweaty horse to the gate of the camp. The sunlight glinted off the silver badge on his chest like a knife. Ada watched him walk down the porch. "What news do you have?" Boyd rubbed his forehead, his voice hoarse with thirst. "It's short but heavy. Silas Kincaid is dead, Ada. We found him in Silver Notch. One in the chest, one in the head. The wind died." Ray stood behind Ada, her hands clasping the edge of the door until they were white. Maggie cried out softly. Bertie, not understanding what death meant, grabbed her sleeve and asked with her eyes. Wyatt came from the backyard, his breath smelling of pine. No one cheered, but in the eyes of the whole family, Ada saw a reflection of something more dangerous than the night Silas had swung his whip. The void left by evil often casts a longer shadow. Boyd swept the toes of his boots across the steps of the stall, lowering his voice. "The body has drag marks. There are other boot prints. I'm not sure yet, but..." Silas had a brother, Wyatt answered for him. "Yes, Caleb Kincaid, who escaped from a cattle robbing case in Nevada. More violent than Silas, violent, but cold-minded." That afternoon, a thick silence rolled around the roof. Ada poured water into the bone broth, stirring, but her mind drifted away. She had longed for Silas to disappear from this world, but now he lay at the bottom of the alley, but his breath still lingered around her, vague like wood smoke rising from the ashes. Wyatt poured her a glass of water, his brown eyes deep. "If Caleb comes, I won't wait for him to walk through the gate." Ada nodded, but her hand unconsciously stroked the scar on her back. "Don't let the kids see any more blood." Wyatt touched the back of her hand, promising without words. The next day the sheep panicked, broke through the line, nearly knocking over the trough. Jesse shielded Bertie with his wooden crutch, calling out someone's howling on the back hill. Wyatt and Ray rode up the slope just in time to see a green-coated figure disappear into the clearing. An old hunting knife was stuck deep into the wooden fence, the handle carved with a crude K. Caleb had given the signal. At night, Wyatt set up a lampstand around the porch like a beacon, and Ada carried the cushions to the main room so that the family slept a few steps apart. Ida, the pale, thin girl Ada had taken care of the week before, sat huddled in the corner, trembling with memories. Ada wrapped herself in a blanket and whispered, "We're not running anymore. There's a wall of fire here." Ida looked up, her eyes swollen, but she nodded. Ray brought the double-barreled gun over and lay beside her, the girl's warmth spreading to Ada's shirt, signaling that fear knew how to shrink when people stood close together. That night, Wyatt put the barn on the roof, and Ada sat by the lamp embroidering the torn blanket. Her needle and thread fumbled for a seam, just as her heart fumbled for a fragile piece. Near midnight, flames shot up. At the end of the field, the hayloft was ablaze in a column of burnt orange. The bell on the porch rang loudly. Wyatt dove in, Jesse limping after him. Ray pulled her two sisters and Ida to the well, passing the bucket of water. Ada held Bertie by the nape of her neck, feeling her heart pounding against her bones. For nearly an hour, they held the fire before it reached the barn. The fire died down, black smoke billowing into the sky, turning the moon into a murky bronze disk. The family coughed. Ada counted heads enough, but the fire in Wyatt's eyes had not yet died down. He threw down the bucket, roaring, "I'll go find him tomorrow night." Ada grabbed her husband's wrist, wiping away the smoke and sweat. "You're not going alone." They didn't wait until nightfall. That morning, Jesse insisted on going with them, even though his leg brace was still on. Wyatt protested, but Ada put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "Let him go. Caleb needs to see our family together." An hour later, Wyatt, Jesse, Ray, and Ada rode after the tracks of the wagons that had been put out last night's fire. Maggie reassured Bertie and Ida at home, her butt-cut rifle hanging from the hook in the kitchen door. The northern plateau was a maze of dust and rocky gorges. The bright sunlight made the limestone gleam silver, mixed with the smell of dry salt. They followed the thick mule tracks that ran zigzag and disappeared at the edge of Mancoyote, a long crack that swallowed the wind. Jesse bent down, picked up the shell casing from the Henry pistol, the firing pin still smelling of gunpowder. Ada shuddered. Silas had been killed by the same bullet. The howling wind in the abyss turned into a twisted laugh when Caleb appeared on the opposite cliff. He wore a blue wool coat, a red scarf around his neck, a Winchester rifle slung over his shoulder. He greeted like an acquaintance. "My new sister-in-law, my younger brother, has come to celebrate the wedding." Ada sat still in the saddle, her chest heaving, but her voice steady. "Your brother died because of the hatred he inflicted. Retreat before the hatred buries you too." Caleb puffed on his cigarette, laughing hoarsely. "Any woman who dares to refuse Kincaid's blood will pay with her own blood. I'm here to take it." Wyatt spurred his horse onto the opposite cliff, his voice deep and hissing. "Your share is lead if you cross this landline?" Caleb shrugged, flicked the end of his cigarette. "The land doesn't choose sides. My gun does." He raised his Winchester, pulled the trigger. The bullet plowed into the cliff where Jesse was. Ray didn't have time to think, lifted the double-barreled gun, and fired back. The double-barreled blast tore through the air, sending the crows flapping their black wings. Caleb ducked the bullet whizzing past his helmet. He rolled, crawled away from the edge, and disappeared behind the rock. Wyatt shouted at his daughter to stop him from firing again, because Caleb had prepared an escape route. He turned to Jesse. "Go back, build a fence locket. He'll turn." Jesse gritted his teeth and nodded. Ada turned her horse's head, feeling a burning sensation in her back. Not from the old whiplash, but from intuition. Caleb didn't hunt with guns at long range. He killed with fear. That afternoon, they returned to the camp, set up fire safety books, gathered the animals close to the yard, and hung lanterns around the roof. At dusk, Ray stroked Birdie's hair, coaxing her to sleep first, but Birdie slept fitfully. Every time the wind knocked on the door, she would wake up and mumble, "The devil in the fields." Ada sat beside her, singing an old folk song that her ex-husband had forbidden her to sing because he said women's songs disturb men's sleep. Now Ada's voice was hoarse with smoke, but Birdie was fading, smiling in her sleep. The sound of animals calling out broke out again in the middle of the night. Outside, Wyatt's old horse was running unsteadily, its mane reeking of kerosene. Someone had poured kerosene on the sheepfold, intending to burn it down. But Caleb refused to light it. He let the kerosene soak into a message fire, was always waiting. Wyatt stroked the horse's mane, his eyes ready to burst into flames. Ada held the animal's nose, listening to its heart pounding. She suddenly realized that Caleb was chipping away at the courage of the whole family, then swinging the knife to finish them off. The next morning, Boyd returned. He had a statewide warrant for Caleb Kincaid's arrest, along with a $50 reward for his whereabouts. Ada looked at the peeling, crooked ink on the paper. The warrant didn't deter Caleb. It just warned him he would be more reckless. Wyatt arranged Ada and Ray to look after the house. He and Jesse set out for Black River Plantation to get more gunmen. Ada protested, offering to go with her. Wyatt shook his head. "There's no point in guns between husband and wife. I need you to keep the fire going so the kids know the house is still standing." He put his arm around her shoulders, few words but a firm grip. His trust was in his arms. They left at noon, and the sky was covered with dark clouds like a cow's tongue snapping across the gourd. Ada covered the rice, straining her ears to hear every clatter. When the night brought a drizzle, she led Ray out to the porch to patrol while Maggie watched Birdie. At least twice Ada thought she saw a green shirt pass by the fence post, but there was only a dark shadow. In the last watch, the sound of horse hooves echoed, but Wyatt's steps were strangely hurried and unsteady. Ray aimed her gun at the gate. The lantern light revealed Jesse, his face pale, his shirt stained with blood at the chest. Wyatt was bent over in the saddle, his shoulder smeared red. Jesse rushed over, his voice hoarse. "Caleb in Rocktail Alley. Dad got shot." Ada threw the lamp, her hands shaking as she pulled Wyatt down. The lead bullet was lodged in the right shoulder, blood not spurting, but seeping out. A sign of danger, more dangerous than a gaping wound. Ray set the table. Maggie boiled water. Birdie sobbed and called, "Don't die, Dad." Ada bit the thread, sterilized the knife, shaking so much that the needle dropped, but still cut. The skin took out the dented bullet. Wyatt gritted his teeth, his hands clutching the table leg. When Ada pulled the bullet out, he passed out. The morning was quiet, the rain had stopped. The sky was gray. Wyatt's breathing was more even, his skin still hot. Jesse lay on the bench, bandaged around his ribs. Caleb had shot him as he rode out to bring his father home. Ada sat between them, her hands holding two veins, her eyes swollen and unblinking. She had bandaged someone who had hit her, now the first time saving the person she loved. Every move was therefore more shaky but also more precise than ever. As the sun rose, Purple Wyatt opened his eyes. Ada leaned closer, tears threatening to fall. He said hoarsely, Ada understood. She pulled Jesse's hand and placed it on her father's white bandaged hand. Ray Maggie Birdie knelt beside them, breath after breath. Ada whispered, "You won't leave us." Wyatt nodded tiredly, his lips cracking into a weak smile. But Caleb was alive, and somewhere he was cocking the barrel of his gun, counting the seconds until the next shot. Ada looked out the window, the sodden meadow glistening like the surface of a broken mirror. Her heart ached. The mirror reflected a tangle of exits, but each one demanded blood. Around noon, Boyd brought more news. Caleb had been more careful after the shooting, slipping into the howling mountains to the west. Ada had tied her hair up and was wearing a waxed cloak. Ray asked, "Where are you going, Mom?" Ada buttoned the last button. "Go and get justice before justice is buried." Her hand no longer shook. The old whiplash cramped in the damp, reminding her of the pain she had paid now. It was her turn to collect the debt for the hearts beating behind this threshold. The wind blew the scent of daisies and the smoke of barn ash. Ada stepped down the steps, pistol tucked into her belt, her cloak brushing the mud, and in her eyes the fire was no longer just for warmth. It was lighting the way down into the abyss where another Kincaid was hiding, breathing in the hate. Wyatt called softly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, but each word was firm. "Don't be what I hate." Ada turned, her smile cutting through the air. "I only bring what you taught me, not to be reborn in fear." The wooden gate opened, light glinting on the bars. Behind her, the Thornhart roof stood in place, the fire still burning, the children still holding hands. That was reason enough to step into the darkness. The trail up Wuthering Mountain wound between limestone and dwarf pines, roots biting into gravel like nails in flesh. Ada tied her horse at the foot of the slope, pulled her waxed cloak close to her neck, and walked along the damp ground. The air smelled of old snow and the smoke of recent fires burning her lungs. Each step reminded her of the healed whiplash. She took it as a drumbeat. Near the top, a metallic clank echoed. Ada crouched by a mossy rock and glanced over. Caleb was smoking the barrel of his Winchester over a makeshift fire. He had taken off his coat and bandaged his shoulder. The wound from Ray's bullet was bleeding. His curses mingled with the wind. Near the fire was a broken wooden chest stuffed with documents, envelopes, and yellowed marriage certificates bearing the names of different women. Ada held her breath. From the night Silas had drunkenly boasted that the Kincaid family kept the family register of wealth, and women she had guessed what her ex-husband kept, that would let his men know the way to his bed. That chest was the black heart of the family. Suddenly, a noise behind her startled her. Boyd and two deputies' guns pointed low, signaled for silence. Ada nodded. They circled left, communicating with their eyes. The wind blew hard, playing with the fire. Caleb looked up, eyes darting. He pulled out a magazine, loaded 5 rounds, and swung the gun around. Ada understood he could smell someone. She stood from her hiding place, raised her pistol, but did not aim, her voice echoing just loud enough. "Caleb Kincaid. Your brother's blood is not yet dry. You want to shoot a widow and 2 children." Caleb jerked, squinting his eyes. He laughed hoarsely. "Mrs. Thornhart, I have come to demand justice for my men. You will pay according to the law." He retreated to the box, stomped on the lid. Ada took another step. "I see the law in your box, all the names of women who were sold, beaten, forced to give birth. That law is just the debt book of hell." He hissed, "Shut up," and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the corner of Ada's shirt, embedded in the rock, sparking. Boyd returned fire, the lead ball plowing the edge of Caleb's hat. The remaining deputy rushed forward, but he rolled into the heather, slid down the ledge, and disappeared from range. Ada gave chase. The slope was slippery, her feet slipped, and she almost fell into the ravine. Caleb crawled first, leaving a trail of bright red blood. He reached the edge of the cliff, the rock split deep like a monster's throat. There was no way. He turned the gun, raised the hammer, and the trigger clicked. Ada had time to aim, but the wind whipped her hair in front of her face. Everything moved in slow motion, like cracked glass. The muzzle flashed, the red lightning flash. The double explosion resounded. The recoil hit Ada's chest, the smell of blood filled her nose. She opened her eyes, Caleb fell, Boyd's bullet lodged in his forehead. Caleb's bullet grazed her hand, slashing a painful line of fire across her thigh. He lunged back, his whole body bouncing off the edge like a ragged mannequin, then disappeared into the windy alley. The last sound was the clatter of rolling rocks. Boyd ran to catch Ada. Blood dripped from the torn shirt, but she stood firm. She looked down the deep alley, saw no body, only the dark shadow of the rocks. The wind blew her hat away, her loose hair whipped against her cheeks. In an instant, all memories of Silas, of the whip, of the flaming pot, turned upside down, then dissipated like smoke caught in a storm. As the afternoon wore on, they dragged the cluttered trunk down the mountain. Ada opened the lid, skimming through the tattered marriage certificates: Clara Denton, Ellen Price, Lucy Walden. Each name with a land sale stamp, a loan receipt, like invisible chains around the necks of women they had never met. Back at camp, Ray and Maggie rushed out the door, finding Ada with bandaged hands and brown eyes ablaze. She reassured them, telling them Caleb was gone, Wyatt was safe. Ray blinked back, her tears nodded. Bertie hugged her mother's leg as if afraid that even the sword of heaven could not separate them. Ada entered Wyatt's room. He leaned against a pillow, his skin dark, but his eyes bright. She sat on the edge of the bed, setting the wooden trunk down. "This is their bitter legacy," she said, her voice carrying the scent of mountain smoke. Wyatt opened a page, skimmed it. His brows furrowed, pained and angry. "Everybody on this list." Ada squeezed his hand. "We're going to find them. Not for Caleb's sake, for the ones who haven't raised their heads yet." For 4 days, Ada, Ray, and Jesse, with their braces, scoured papers, taking names, marking out the territory. Boyd found a few forced properties in the county. Marshal Carver stopped by from the next town carrying a warrant to search the ranches in which Kincaid had invested. One morning, as Wyatt leaned on his cane for the first time on the porch, the dawn was just sprinkling gold on the thatch. Ada handed him a clean handwritten list. 18, she said. 6 might still be around. "I'm going." Wyatt put a warm hand on the back of her neck. "We're going. You're not alone." On the day of departure, Ray wore her mother's old coat and Maggie tucked a Jesse whittled clip into Bertie's hair. The stove was out, but the warmth hung in the lingering smell of cornbread. Ida stood in the doorway, clutching the hem of her new dress, and suddenly burst into tears. "I want to go too, so that when the girls see me, they will believe." Ada hugged the young girl, nodding. "You are the proof." They spread out in 3 small groups. Ada led Ray and Ida to Dry Ravine Farm, where the sick wife was rumored to be hidden behind the barn. Jesse and Boyd headed south, and Wyatt, though still wounded, rode slowly along the route Marshal Carver had chosen. The early autumn moon hung low, golden as oil. Ada stopped her horse in front of the cracked roof of the hut. She saw the blonde girl holding her child, her eyes purple, trembling at the sight of the stranger. Ada dismounted, rolled up her sleeves, revealing the faded scars. She held up her empty hands and said softly, "My name is Ada Thornhart. I was pulled from the camp I called home. I've come to pull you out today if you want me to." The girl ducked into the shadows, tears streaming down her face. Ida stepped forward, holding out her bony hands. "I was beaten until I forgot my name. Now I have a name again." The girl burst into tears, falling to her knees. Ada supported her, feeling her body trembling and limp like a seed that had not yet taken root. They continued on at each stop, adding 1 or 2 pale faces, a trembling hand, a name retrieved. The list of 18, finally 14, stepped out of the darkness. The other 4 were dead, confirmed by the anonymous wooden plaques on the roadside. But Ada laid flowers, silently reading their names as if they had been called one last time. When the group, now 20 strong, including dirty children and light-fearing wives, returned to the grassy slopes in front of Thornhart Farm, Wyatt stood under the porch, leaning on his cane, waiting. The afternoon sun brushed his beard with gold, casting long shadows down the steps. Bertie shouted home and ran out. Ray helped the women, Maggie fetched water, and Jesse played with the new children. Ada looked at the scene, suddenly remembering Silas's hiss. "My house needs only silence." This house was not silent. It echoed with footsteps, laughter, even tears, and so it lived. That first night when everyone else was asleep, Ada sat at the kitchen table, spread out a map covered with staples. Wyatt sat opposite, his shoulder still bandaged, but his eyes steady. "Caleb is done," he said. "You owe no more revenge." Ada stroked the map. "I do not take revenge," she replied. "I give back the names of the robbed. Then we will plant new grass on the ashes." She traced a path with her finger. "When the grass grows, we will plant stakes, hang signs, and write in large letters. Warmth is not a privilege, but a right." The oil lamp flickered, reflecting the warm brown light in the eyes of two people from two different dark places. The ashes were closed, but this time the fire was not to burn. It was lit to show the way to light each step for the group of people who followed behind, and for those who did not know they were looking for a roof to laugh. The early autumn wind blew down the valley in a harmony of drying cloth, cowbells and children chasing each other. 4 weeks after embracing 14 new people, Thornhart Ranch looked different. The old barn was a weaving room. The front porch had a canopy over a pine pole. The fire burned all night long from the stew pots that were no longer sparingly distributed. Ada walked through the muddy yard, clutching a basket of Ray's first apples, her eyes darting around with a mixture of pride and fear. This new life was fragile. A single bad wind could tear it all apart. That afternoon, the county mail truck jolted up the dusty road and stopped at the gate. The young mailman handed over a stack of papers stamped with the court seal and a hastily pasted flyer, "Thornhart Ranch Refuge for Women in Need." Ada skimmed through it, her heart fluttering as she saw Judge Wilcox's signature. Their land was officially designated as a temporary sanctuary. This meant the county government would take on some of the protection, but it also meant their name would be spread far and wide to those who had yet to put down the whip. Ada brushed back her hair, sniffed the dry scent of apples, reminded herself that the stronger the light, the more the darkness crept in. At night, Ada spread out paper on the kitchen table. Wyatt sat next to her, drawing plans for a new sheepfold, the scent of healing turpentine around him. The children whispered their spelling lessons in the corner of the stove. The rescued wives peered anxiously. Ada read the terms aloud. "You are authorized to welcome, care for, and shelter for up to 30 days any woman who seeks refuge. You are authorized to use the sheriff's force if threatened." She paused, looked at Ray, then at Maggie, then at Wyatt. "We have become a fortress, but a fortress needs guards and a crop." She chuckled. "So tomorrow put up a fence on the north side and sow the winter cabbage before the cold." The next morning, dew glistening on the clipped grass, Ada and Ray and Ida measured stakes and hammered. The sound of the hammering mingled with the singing of women who had been silent all their lives. After noon, the sound of hooves echoed from afar, but this time not lurking, but urgently pleading. A young woman carrying a child, her shirt torn at the shoulders, jumped off her horse in front of the gate. She trembled and held out her swollen hand. "People say that when you come here, you will no longer cry for fear." Ada took the child, her warmth blowing against her collar, then hugged the mother's shoulder. "Here tears fall to water the seeds," Ada said, her voice as deep as the earth, stilling the rain. At dusk, another child hobbled after Bertie. Another wife tore the debt label from her skirt. Another pile of raised wood propped up on the barn roof. The stove boiled again. The fire licked the stew pot. The smell of onions and cinnamon permeated the old bones of the house. Wyatt leaned against the door, watching the light seep through the not-so-closed planks, and whispered to Ada, "Now that fire will not only light me, but will be a landmark in the night for many people." Ada nodded, her hand holding her husband's calloused one. The autumn wind whistled through the porch, carrying further away the belief that in this dusty land, a seed had sprouted that no one else had. 3 years later, the spring breeze swept across the Silver Eye Prairie, carrying the smell of freshly baked cornbread and the laughter of children bursting like birds out of a cage. Thornhart Farm now had 2 more wooden buildings, a new well, and a light-colored ironwood porch. On the crossbar, the familiar words, "Free Loved," were carved, deeply painted with a final mixture of linseed oil and old fire ashes to remind all who passed that before there was love, there was ashes. Ada stood under the arch, her indigo skirt fluttering in the wind, her scarred hands holding a new baby girl, Ruth Walden's child rescued from the mine, in Wyatt's arms. The girl looked up at the sign with doe eyes and giggled. Ada pressed her forehead to the baby's, feeling the warm breath of milk on her cheek like a command to continue living. In the yard, Ray taught the young mother how the sentinels tied straw to prevent fires. Jessie, now walking straight, whistled to the sheep. Maggie planted the winter cabbage patch, pinning a whittled birdie clip in Ida's hair. Each once broken person became a link in the chain that held the community upright. As dusk poured honey into the kitchen, Ada opened her leather book, now several pages thicker, and wrote Hope Walden on line 47. She closed the book, her fingers stroking the worn spine. Each word is a torch, she whispered. Wyatt put his hand on his wife's shoulder, his brown eyes still burning. And the night is long. Ada smiled, turning toward the dusty road to the west. In the distance, a lone horse appeared in the pale purple light, another soul reaching for the porch light. She pulled the gate open a notch, the torch in her hand flared. The journey had come full circle, but the road to freedom, like the wind, continued to call her home.